Welcome everybody to our webinar, From Funding to Implementation. This is the second webinar in a three-part series. We started with the technology roadmap in the first webinar, and our next webinar will be all about implementation. We encourage you as part of this seminar to submit questions in the chat function. Please, at any time throughout the session, feel free to do that. There will be some poll questions in this seminar, so please feel free when you see the poll to come up to go ahead and answer the polling questions. It will help us to provide more information to you. Presentation slides can be downloaded at the end of the presentation from the webinar control panel. The webinar will also be recorded and we will send it out for on-demand access after the session. And at the conclusion of the webinar, we'll put a short survey in and we'll ask you to fill that out. And if you have any additional questions that you would like to follow up on, please feel free to add them to that survey. Without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Steve Dawson, who will get us started. Thank you.
All right, afternoon, everyone. Cindy, do you want to do a quick intro? Then I'll do mine.
Sure. My name is Cindy Walter. I'm a managing director at Sikich. I've spent probably about 40 years in this space across HR operations and technology, and very pleased to be with you today.
Great, thanks, Cindy. So I'm Steve Dawson. I'm also managing director in the HCM and payroll consulting practice at Sikich. So Cindy's got me beat. I've got a little over 25 years of experience in this space in both client-side roles as well as consulting roles. And like Cindy, I'm also in the Boston area. So just a little bit about me. Okay, in terms of our agenda today, so we're going to kind of start off with some framing and sort of talk to you about sort of our point of view on how you transition from sort of building your business case and your roadmap to getting ready for an implementation project. So there's a lot of work that kind of comes in between those milestones. And so we kind of want to frame that up. We're going to talk a lot today about requirements, about process, vendor selection, contracting, staffing, and project planning. So a lot of good content for you this afternoon. So Cindy, I think we have our first poll.
So our first question, is your organization anticipating a vendor evaluation in 2023? Please go ahead and select one. There are 4 options. Yes, we've already started the process. Yes, in the first half of the year. Yes, in the second half of this year, or no, not this year. All right, so we've got a split here. We've got about 20% with yes, we've already started an evaluation. That's good to hear. 20%, we're going to start one in the first half of this year. 31% anticipating starting in the second half of this year, and 31% saying no, we're probably not going to do one this year. So a good mix of where you are. So thank you.
All right, excellent. Well, hopefully we've got something for everyone today. Okay, so to kick us off, as Cindy mentioned, our last webinar, for those of you that were not participants, it covered how to build a business case and a roadmap ultimately to get funding for an HR technology investment. Okay, so let's assume that you've done that, you've been successful, and now you have funding. And so really the question that we're trying to answer in this webinar is, okay, so now what? What comes next? So we find that clients are really in kind of two schools of thought at this stage. So where we'd like you to be is sort of in the camp that we're describing as ready, aim, fire. Within that camp, right, these clients recognize that there's a lot of due diligence that needs to be done before you're ready for that formal project kickoff. Unfortunately, not everyone's in that camp, and we do regularly run into clients who are more in this, what we kind of term the ready, fire, aim camp. Those clients can't wait to kick off their project, and they move almost immediately into project execution, and generally come to regret that decision later as they kind of pay a heavy price, down the road. So we kind of liken it to, you're about to take a long road trip, but you didn't take the time to air up the tires or fill up the gas tank, and you forgot to bring a map. Are you going to get to your final destination? Yeah, eventually. Are you going to get there, in the shortest amount of time and with the least amount of aggravation? Probably not. So we strongly encourage you not to be in this, ready, fire, aim camp. What that looks like on the ground is, your project, because you're so eager to just dive in and, start getting the work done, that a lot of times you've kind of squandered the opportunity to really impact your business, and your project kind of morphs into just a software replacement. And so you end up replacing, vendor A with vendor B, and that, that's kind of what we term paving the cow path. And ultimately the result of that is you find out that you've got most, if not all, of your old problems. It's just on, a new software platform. So we changed out the platform, but we didn't really solve any of the problems. We didn't really move the ball forward, so to speak. We spent a lot of time and effort and money, and we just kind of moved sideways. And yeah, we have a new software, but it probably failed to meet a number of our expectations. And again, we feel like the biggest contributor to this is clients who skip the necessary preparation work to position themselves for success. Okay, so one of the best things that you can do when you've got your funding and you're starting to get yourself organized, to avoid falling into this trap of paving the cow path, you have to really, really stay focused. Go back to your business case and really think about what it was that motivated the leaders in your organization to fund this project, right? What results are they looking for? What goals are they wanting to achieve? What problems are they wanting solved? What are the outcomes, the tangible, measurable outcomes that frankly you're accountable for? You need to make sure that every decision you make every action that you take on this project is aligned to those business drivers. And that's the best thing that you can do to try to avoid falling into the, paving the cow path trap. All right. So we're going to really focus in this webinar again on kind of this approach that we're terming ready, aim, fire. So ready was our last webinar, right, that talked about how to build that business case for funding. Today, we're really going to focus on this aim component, right? So getting ready for execution. And you'll see there's the methodology that we're recommending here there's a series of activities. We've kind of grouped those activities into kind of 3 categories, if you will. And these are meant to be sequential. And we're going to go into each one of these in a lot more detail in today's session. Okay, so this is going to be primarily what we focus on today. Before we do that and dig in, I'll just make a second plug for our next webinar that Cindy referenced at the beginning. So the kind of the final piece to this is going to be project execution, so that implementation phase, and then what comes after implementation, right? There's still a lot of work post-implementation. And so we kind of are bundling all of that into the next webinar, and that would equate to FIRE in the Ready, Aim, Fire kind of nomenclature. Okay, so just to kind of give you that preview of coming attractions. All right, so let's dig in. This is the first series of activities that we recommend you do after you've received your business case funding. So there's really 4 key decisions that you need to make. And you'll see here, definition, structure, strategy, and timelines. So we've kind of grouped these key decisions in these kind of 4 categories. And now we'll kind of step through each of these in a little more detail. All right, so let's start with definition. You know, a lot of clients, because they're so close to it, you know, they think that their projects, you know, are really obvious, and you know what it is that they're trying to accomplish. You know, everybody gets it, and it's crystal clear, and everyone's on the same page. And generally speaking, that couldn't be further from the truth. So an exercise that we really encourage at this stage is to really sit down and put pen to paper and answer 3 questions, right? What's your project purpose? 25 words or less. You know, outcomes. What will be different upon completion of the project? And then finally, what's the definition of success? What does success look like? You know, and who will be impacted? And hopefully those sound like pretty simple questions, right? I mean, they're simple to ask. It's probably a lot harder than you realize to answer those. And you'll be amazed, right? If you get a you know, kind of a cross-functional group of people into a room to answer these questions, I think it will be eye-opening the wide variety of responses you'll get, which is really great. It's actually really, really great to try to get all of these stakeholders on the same page about what is this project. So that's where we recommend you start. That will then enable you to kick off your project communications. So again, we really strongly advocate that communication is critical throughout the life of a project. I mean, we've learned this lesson time and time again, that lack of communication can really sabotage a project. And it starts right here. It starts with getting everyone on the same page about what the project is, and frankly, what the project is not. And so that's what we recommend you do once you've gone through this exercise, is you start getting people aligned and, you know, with a common understanding of what this project is. All right, then we move into structure. So this is where you're starting to put your team together, right? So you're starting to answer questions. Who's on the team? You know, what hat are they wearing? You know, how are we going to organize? You know, how, you know, are we going to have different work streams within the project, and what are those going to be, and who's going to lead the different work streams, right? Who's a member versus a leader? You know, who's playing a project manager role, etc. Right? These are all very important questions that need to be answered. You know, to make these decisions, you need to think about what skill sets people have. How much capacity do people have? And you're probably going to find some challenges. If you're really being honest, you're probably going to encounter often situations where, well, the people that have capacity don't necessarily have the skills we're looking for, and vice versa, right? People that have the skills are already double booked and triple booked. And you don't want to ignore that reality. You want to be honest, and you want to try to figure out realistically, what kind of commitment can we get from people? Who do we need on this project? And frankly, where do we need to go outside and get help? Okay, that's what's going on as you're kind of working through these structure questions. And with that, Cindy, back to you, I think, for our second poll question.
Here we go with another poll question. So this one, what is your organization's project staffing plan? And as Steve was just saying, this is a very critical element of your project. We don't have one. We've assigned a project manager and they're going to define it. We haven't even thought about it, or we're going to seek outside support. And that may be a capacity issue or a skills issue when you're seeking outside support. So please take a minute and let us know what you're thinking here. I've got the Jeopardy theme in my head. All right, so 6%, we don't have one. 50%, we've assigned the project manager. The project manager will define it. So we're going to talk more about that because that's critical. We haven't thought about it. That's scary, but it might not have come up yet in your process. And 25%, we're going to seek outside help. So 50%, we're expecting the project manager to do it. About 25% either doesn't have one or hasn't thought about it. And 25% know that they need to seek outside help again, either because they don't have capacity or they don't have skills. So with that, we'll continue the presentation.
All right, thanks, Cindy. Okay, so the next decision area that we've called strategy. You can think of this as sort of, I guess, a combination of project governance and project process. So this is kind of getting into questions like, hopefully on the project staffing side, right? One of the key groups that you identify is your steering committee. Sometimes that work kind of bleeds into this set of decisions. So you need a steering committee. You also need to identify who your stakeholders are. And then you need to figure out, how do we engage with those stakeholders on a formal basis? So how are we going to do that? How often are we going to do that? How are we going to manage issues and risks, right? Every project has issues and risks. What is our approach around managing those? How are we going to prioritize, and are we going to make trade-off decisions when inevitably, time and resources and scope are in conflict and something has to give? How are we going to make those decisions? Right? It's important to think that through and have an approach. That's what we mean by project process. And have an approach for how those things get identified and how they'll get resolved. At a high level, it's a good idea to be on the same page about if we're talking about technology implementation. Is this going to be a big bang? Is this going to be a phased release? So we're going to do this more incrementally as opposed to big bang. And if it is going to be phased, how is it going to be phased? Is it phased by functionality? Is it phased by geography? A lot of different choices. But those are very different projects, right? Big bang versus phased. So it's important that you have a point of view right at the get-go of how you're approaching this. What are your go live criteria? So in order to go live, what must be true, right? What are all the things that have to be accomplished in order for you to have a successful go live. It is not too early to start putting together a list and really soliciting, stakeholder expectations for, what's a critical go, what's going to feed into our go, no go decision. What would concern you enough where it might be a no go, right? What would you have to see in order to be comfortable? It's not too early to start collecting that. Okay, so that's kind of what we refer to as sort of a series of strategy decisions that you need to make. And then finally, in the decision category, we've got timeline. So you need to start putting some stakes in the ground around timing. So at this stage, right, this is not a detailed project plan. This is not the detailed schedule, at a task level. That comes later. These are just high-level kind of milestones, and they're rough, right? They're not precisely a date. It's not February 17th. It might be the first quarter, the second quarter, the month of February, what have you. But it's certainly not typically something so specific as a day. There are going to be a number of considerations, right, that are going to lead you to kind of putting these stakes in the ground. So you need to think about, what are some of the timeline drivers? So for example, it could be, a business acquisition or a divestiture. It could be that your current software, is no longer going to be supported as of a certain date. Maybe there's some new regulatory compliance mandate that takes effect, in a certain time frame, and there's work that you need to do to be compliant. But think about what are these different business drivers that are influencing your timeline, and try to align your timeline, to these business drivers, because that will start to give shape to your project. And then it's really important that you, at this juncture, that you socialize these dates, right? So all these decisions that we're making in terms of, who's on the team, and, and what hat are they wearing, and, kind of what's our overall approach and thinking about, how we're going to implement this, and from a timeline perspective, when we're looking to implement. All of these things need to be socialized with your sponsors, with your stakeholders, and make sure that everybody's on the same page. And doing that now, doing that early, will really, really pay dividends later. Okay, so we've gone through kind of those key decision areas, and now we're moving into our second kind of phase of activities. If you remember back to that slide where we kind of laid out sort of 3 key sets of activities. So this is that second set of activities. So in this set, we are going to document our requirements, and that will hopefully then enable us to prepare a RFP document that we'll be able to send out to potential vendors. That in turn will enable us to have a formal vendor selection process, and then hopefully kind of a clear winner emerges from that process, a vendor that's best aligned to your needs, and you can enter into kind of a contracting phase, right, to start a commercial relationship with that vendor. Okay, so let's dig into this set. So you're going to have a lot of requirements. So when we think about requirement gathering, this can be pretty staggering, right? You will have a lot of requirements, and in a moment, we'll kind of give you our point of view around sort of how to approach this requirement gathering process. But before we do that, we want to kind of talk about requirement prioritization. So you're going to have a lot of requirements. One mistake that we see clients make is they don't prioritize their requirements. So it just becomes a bulleted list of requirements, right? And this can just be page after page of requirements, right? It's just kind of a dump of requirements. And where that becomes challenging is later on in the vendor selection phase. So you've got all these requirements and you put them in your RFP, and then, you know, you provide that to all your potential vendors, and they come back to you with responses, and you're trying to compare the different vendors, right? And they're going to be different. Each vendor is going to have strengths, they're going to have weaknesses, they're going to meet some but not all of your requirements, but it'll be different by vendor, which requirements they meet, which requirements they don't. And if you don't prioritize your requirements, you're going to really struggle to differentiate the vendors. And so this is why we strongly, strongly encourage you to prioritize your requirements, because it's going to help you later as you're kind of comparing different vendors. A challenge that you're going to have, so I guess a framework that we often use, right, is very simple. A requirement is either critical, which is a must-have, it's an important requirement, or, you know, kind of should have, or it's nice to have. Like that's a very good framework of assigning kind of one of those three categories to each requirement. Sounds simple enough. What we would point out, what becomes really challenging with this is people are not going to agree on prioritization. You're going to find that prioritization is in the eye of the beholder, and that different people will see things as critical versus nice to have. There probably isn't going to be agreement on all requirements, and you're going to have to find some way to bring objectivity into the process, because at the end of the day, you're going to have to give every requirement a priority, and when there's not a consensus in the room, you're going to have to figure out how you kind of referee that and ultimately land on a decision. So this can be challenging, but it is really, really critical to your success that you do this. Okay, so now let's talk about how do I go about gathering requirements? Well, a good place to start is really looking at your current state. You know, think about all of your inputs, right? So look at all your forms, whether they be paper forms, whether they be, you know, electronic forms, but, you know, look at all the data that you're capturing, right? And those are all your inputs. And then, you know, think about your outputs, you know, integrations, reports, you know, anything that comes out of the system. Think about any kind of processing that the system does, or, you know, transformation that the system does, right? All of that will kind of lead you to, you know, different requirements that you have. So that's typically where we recommend clients start, right? This is a really good exercise. What I would call out here is it's extremely important to be honest with yourself about how are we augmenting the system? What are we doing offline? What are we doing in spreadsheets and, you know, Word documents and whatnot? Because frankly, the system has limitations that we adapt to with, you know, different workarounds and band-aids. It's really a good idea at this stage to sort of inventory those workarounds and band-aids, okay? Because that's really going to inform you. So that's where you start as far as requirements gathering and looking at the current state. You know, I would say that work is necessary, but not sufficient. Because if you stop there, you're running the risk of paving the cow path that we talked about earlier. So if you really want this project to be transformational, you're missing a huge opportunity if you don't then transition to designing your future state process. So you have an amazing opportunity to harmonize and streamline your business processes. You know, if you take advantage of that and do that work at this juncture. So let's just talk a little bit more about that. So our point of view around process is, you know, that process should drive technology and not the other way around. When technology drives process, it's sort of like the tail wagging the dog. So we really encourage you to think about, what would be the ideal processes for your organization. And, for the most part, those processes should be, vendor agnostic. So they may not be technology agnostic in that they may assume that certain technology exists, which is fine, but it shouldn't be dependent on a specific vendor, right? Because the technology is not the process, right? The technology is just an enabler of process. So we really recommend that clients take this opportunity to really envision what would the ideal process look like in the future, right? And document that. And then the whole point of doing that is to identify additional requirements, right? That will really help to inform your requirement gathering exercise, because there may be future requirements that you didn't identify when you were just looking at your current state. And those requirements that you surface through this exercise may be key to enabling you to hit those business objectives that got you funding in the first place. So that's why we can't emphasize strongly enough how important this exercise is. And I think, the other thing I'll call out is, this is challenging to do. And this is another area where frequently we find that clients don't have a lot of in-house expertise doing this type of work, and they benefit greatly from having a partner who can help them, work through this. But please don't skip this process assessment, because it's really, really important pre-work before you get to your project kickoff. And I think with that, Cindy, I am handing the baton to you.
Thank you, Steve. So I wanted to just stop for a minute and think about some of the most important things that Steve has shared with us. And I want to, as I go through the rest of these slides, share not only some content and some thoughts, but some experiences from having done projects, whether they're small projects for companies of 250 or large projects with tens of thousands of employees. So to start off, Steve has talked a number of times about communication. Communication, communication, communication. You cannot over communicate on a project. And as you communicate to your supporters, it's equally important to communicate to your resistors, those people who are constantly looking for a reason to say, see, I told you so, see, I knew it wasn't going to work, etc. So communicate loud, often, clear, send out newsletters, talk to people on the hallway, have your elevator pitch. Steve talked about that earlier. Have your 2-minute elevator pitch. So when you're going from the first floor to the 5th floor and you got an executive on board, you can explain why this project is in their best interest. So you want to do a lot of that. You want to be prepared for that kind of stuff. Another thing that Steve has talked about is process. So what's a process? I was thinking this morning about the easiest way to describe a process to someone who isn't focused on processes every day. There are a lot of people who never in their life have to think about process. But if you think about a simple process, an example of a simple process is on Friday afternoon when your 12-year-old comes and says, where's my allowance for this week, right? So the process is I'm going to reach into my pocket. I'm going to compare, are the chores done or are they not done? And I'm going to hand over cash. That's my process today. In the future, my process might be that on Friday, he has a card now, a bank card, and the money's automatically deposited into his account. It gets me out of the process, it gets me out of the responsibility for carrying cash, and it gets him into a new way of doing his business, right? So process is important. It's hard work. It's in some ways, it's a drag because it's very detail oriented, but it's important. So now we're going to go to the request for proposal, and all of that stuff that you've been doing, communicating, looking at your processes, remembering your business drivers, are going to feed into your RFP. And you've got that clarity. Now you want to go and start conversations with vendors, and we're going to talk about how you do that and what kinds of conversations you're going to have. And you need to identify who those vendors are that are going to fit, number one, a realistic budget, because we can all go out and order a Bugatti, as my son says, but we may only need, you know, a Bronco. So let's figure out, or we may need a Hyundai. Let's figure out what we need and is going to fit us. So Steve, if you could advance the slide. So we've got one more poll question for you, and that is, has your organization done any market analysis? So do you know what vendors are out there that could meet your needs? No, we don't know even where to start. That's legitimate. We've started, but we're struggling to get to a short list because we like a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Or yes, we've already done that work and we have our short list. So we'll wait just a minute for folks to respond. And I will say, while everybody's making their decisions, their elections, it's not obvious where to start if you've never done this before. There's a lot of information out there, and where to start matters, and how to start. You know, we can all say, oh, we're going to Google it, right? So let's see. No, we're not sure where to start, 13%. We've started, but we're struggling, 38%. So clearly half of you are saying this is not easy and we're trying to figure it out. And then another half has said, yes, we've got our shortlist. So we've been through this first part of the process and we're ready to move forward. Okay, so we can keep going. All right, so the request for proposal, that means you've got to connect, you've got to communicate with vendors. And one of the things to think about is this has changed. Like everything else in our world today, this has changed. It used to be you did a 50 to 75 page document and you had, oh, everything in there, everything but the kitchen sink. Now, short, succinct. The vendors don't want to go through 50 to 75 pages. They want to know what's critical. They want to have a sense of your budget. They want to have a sense of your timeline. And for you, it's critical to say to them, and here's the knockouts. If you cannot do these 3 things or 2 things or 1 thing, then we know already you're not a match for us. So get that information out there. Talk to your vendors. They'll tell you if they have a format. We have formats that we can share with you. To make this as streamlined as possible. So there you go. So we're going to research the market. So where do we start? One choice is Gartner. So Gartner is an information firm that gives you a lot of information, not only about the vendors that are in the marketplace and where they sit relative to each other. So you've probably heard of the Gartner Magic Quadrant. And they will actually compare all the existing HCM vendors, but they'll also give you some watch outs and some thoughts on how to go through this process. If you have particular vendors that you're interested in, go look at their websites, see what they say. And third, the same as any time you're making any consumer decision, ask your friends. And in this case, your friends are colleagues across HR organizations. And you may have some HR groups that you belong to, or you may just meet informally with others in HR, but ask others to get their input. Make sure that if you have an ERP, so an enterprise solution, that you're in contact with your IT team, because they may hold the keys to your kingdom in terms of what your choices are. And then hold an initial conversation with some of the vendors that are of interest to you. This is that first conversation that you let them do their marketing thing. You let them do their razzle dazzle for you. And from all of that information that you've gathered, develop a short list of vendors, typically 2 to 4, who can meet your requirements and whose strategy and market approach is aligned with yours. Okay, Steve. One of the other things that we are careful about doing when we're working on projects with clients is to create a level playing field for all of the vendors. Make sure that they get the same information at the same time. You can do an email with documentation that you're sending to them and list them all on a blind copy if they don't want others to know who's in the process. And schedule preliminary meetings that are one step up from that marketing call. And this is probably your vendor's going to ask you for about an hour. They're going to want to come and understand your goals to make sure your organization and their organization are aligned. One of the other things that you're going to find out in these conversations is how well the vendors listen to you. And make note of that, because if you're sharing what your goals are and they're talking about, where they want to be that is different from where your goals are, that's going to be important going forward. That's not going to change. So you want to get alignment as part of this to go into those vendor evaluation meetings. Okay. So I'm going to just take a pause here and talk about building your team. This is where, whether you're the sponsor or the project manager or a business owner, you want to be selfish. Now, we don't often talk about being selfish. You want the best and the brightest on your team if you want the best and the brightest results from the project. So I'll give you an example. I do a lot of work with clients on technology solutions, and we always go in and do process work first. I have a colleague who is, I joke with her and I tell her she's the czarina of process. It's one of her skills, but she's outstanding at process. So I'm always going to go and try and see if she's available if I've got to do process work, because I know that skill and I want the best result from my client. You want broad organizational representation, not just HR, not just IT. Make sure you've got finance, make sure you've got procurement, and make sure you've got representatives of your key business areas. In that, whether it's your executive sponsors or your business representatives, you've got decision makers. Communicate expectations. We've talked about communication. That's end to end, from the minute you start a project until the minute you've stabilized. And then meet with whoever your sponsors are to make sure the team is empowered to do the work. The worst thing you can do is tell a team they're empowered, but then they find out in a week or 2 weeks that they're really not. So make sure you've got an empowered team. Okay, the next slide we'll go through pretty quickly here. Provide your vendors with the requirements, again, based on a standard template for all of your vendors that's streamlined and that highlights here are the knockouts. Manage the time between demos. You don't want to do a demo a week for 5 weeks or 4 weeks. You want to generally keep them pretty close together within a day or 2 days of each other, so that it's fresh in people's mind when they go from one to the next. And you want the evaluations that are part of that process, you want to collect them at the conclusion of each demo, so that people aren't trying to remember and getting confused about which vendor said which thing. So that's important as well. If we go to the actual vendor selection, now you've had everybody in the room. They're filling out their evaluation is their voice. And you want to encourage them to use their voice in this process. And what really comes out of those evaluations, in general, you're going to get a lot of the same responses in the evaluations. If you have a 5-scale response, a lot of them are going to be either grouped in the middle or clustered, but you're not typically going to get huge variation across your team. If you do, understand why that happens. So follow up with the participant, understand why they're outliers. And then when you've gotten to the priority of the vendor, so the preference, make sure that you tell the team before you go and tell the sponsors. Do a vendor election of references, and then make sure that your references are consistent with your evaluations. Okay, Steve? Based on all of your input, develop a proposal, and then you're going to take that proposal to your sponsors and make sure the proposal is aligned to your business case. Be ready to answer any questions. And now you're going to ask them the final question: are we ready to move forward with contracting? So once we get to contracting, contracting is another area of expertise. Software contracting, software as a service contracting, is a specific skill set that somebody on your procurement team probably has, because there's probably someone who focuses on technology vendors. The one important takeaway from this slide is this. This is your one opportunity to negotiate the baseline. The initial pricing and every future penny that you're going to pay over the long-term ownership of this software comes from this initial negotiation, because everything's going to be a percentage on top, a percentage on top. So make sure that you've got a skilled negotiator on your side, because the vendors all, will have a lot of pushback in terms of pricing, what's included, what's not included. This is a chance to pre-negotiate prices for modules you don't need today, but you expect to need in the future. It's also the opportunity to manage the population changes. So as your population increases or decreases, and we just worked with a vendor who has an escalator when population increases by 100, 500, 1,000. But if the population decreases, there's no de-escalator. Make sure you're aware of those things, and also engage your IT organization to understand what their needs are relative to the contract and the software. So if we continue, and contracting is initiated with your procurement team, and here are all of the steps, including you want service level agreements, you want data privacy clauses in there, and once your procurement team is finished and the contract is executed, you can move forward. And now you're going to move forward to project planning. Project planning starts at the top, which is a governance model. The governance model will tell you who are your executive support team, who are your sponsors. These are the people you're going to go to tell them the good news, more importantly, to tell them when there's an issue, and to help get them to problem solve with you, or to select an option that you've put together for them. This is the group that's going to empower the team. Your project plan is typically developed by your project manager. Again, a very specific set of skills. And if there's one thing that I would encourage you to think about in a project manager, do you want leadership? Do you want management? Or do you want a combination of both? So I'll talk about that again in just a minute. You need a resource plan. Steve talked about this, capacity versus skills. So you want skills, and if you have capacity issues, talk through options around capacity. Change management, as Steve was mentioning, you don't want to just take the old problems and the old solution and put it on new software. Therefore, there's going to be a lot of behavior change, and it doesn't happen by osmosis. And the others, the budget, you want to make sure you're tracking for overages. You want a document repository so that you're collecting and maintaining the documents that are going to be moving forward your reference materials. Okay. When you're planning, make sure that you're planning for celebrations. You know, project work is hard, it's intense, it's exhausting. It's fun, but make sure you're planning for celebrations. Celebrations including during the project, you know, it might be time to send people away to dinner with their family who they haven't seen for 3 months because they've been heads down on your project. You know, I worked on a project once where we had a pajama party because we had to work around the clock. It was a global project, and to get stuff done, we were working around the clock, and so we had a pajama party, but then we sent people home to their families. And the team needs opportunities to celebrate and bond together for all of their accomplishments. You may want to do small financial rewards at the conclusion of the project. You want to do significant project rewards. Depending on your organization, you know what that is, including a team celebration with executive recognition. And remember, throughout the project, you got to plan for work-life balance. Okay. Project staffing. You got a project manager, and early on we did a polling question, and a number of you said that you expect your project manager to be responsible, the key person for staffing, as long as that person has the authority to go and get the staff that they need, the skills, not the here's somebody who's available. And you want to identify what those skills are. So let's just talk about the skills for the project team. You need detail orientation, as well as the ability to look at things from a big picture perspective. You need resilience. You need people who are inquisitive. You need people who like going on, learning new software and pushing it to do something that it wasn't intended to do necessarily, but you need it to do for your own organization. You need agility and flexibility on that team. So work on that as you're thinking through your project staffing. Okay, we can keep going. Sponsors need to be unwavering supporters. You want to make sure that they're not going to blow with the wind. And when somebody comes in and they, you know, there's some conflict or whatever, you need your sponsors to be there for you. Draft the best resources. And this is where, and we saw this in the polling question, you may or may not have internal resources. You may have some skill gaps that you need to fill from outside using a combination of vendor resources, consulting resources. This is a lot of the work that we do, is go in and support project management, project implementation. And you also need to think about when you're pulling somebody onto a project, how are you going to backfill? So, and get your cheerleaders and your resistors, and you know, both are going to be important to success. So we've got just a couple of slides left because I see we've got quite a few questions here. Staffing guidelines, who's going to manage the project based on, again, I'm going to say it again, leadership versus management versus a combination of the two. And make sure you've got your internal subject matter experts. Don't forget other areas of the organization. And also think about full-time versus part-time resources. Part-time is very difficult for people to come on and off of a project and go back and do their regular job. So be mindful of what you're asking people to do. So we're almost there. So some common errors under budgeting, because you forget things like backfills, celebrations, bonuses, outside resources, a contingency plan. Teams, taking people who are available versus skilled and not having a good balance of seasoned vets versus novices. Projects can be growth assignments as long as it's not a growth assignment for everybody who's on the team. The timeline always gets robbed. somebody comes in the middle of the project and says, we need to add this one thing, or we need to spend more time doing this. And the project timeline gets squeezed and squeezed. What typically gets squeezed is testing, so you don't have enough time to testing. Be careful about that. Processes. Steve has talked a lot about that, about paving the cow path. The other one that we sometimes use is putting lipstick on the pig. Priorities, Steve also mentioned, make sure you've got strong, agreed upon prioritization. Nobody gets everything. Everybody gets something. And that's the compromise of a project. And then finally, we just want to share what are the characteristics of highly successful projects on our last slide. Unwavering executive support. So when the going gets tough, the tough get going, and they're there to support you. Experienced project management, all the other things that Steve has talked about in terms of understanding your business, etc. The right mix of internal and external resources, team bonding. The team is going to spend a lot of time together, and it's tough spending a lot of time together in the trenches day after day. One of the not often talked about challenges when you're bringing people onto a team, where do I go back to? Do I still have a job? And the last one that we talk about is having fun. Even though the projects are hard and some days they're grueling, you want to make sure the team is having fun because they're doing something that's critical to the business. So there's a lot more information on the slides as you read through them. I'm going to let you go ahead and get copies of the slides so you can look at additional detail. We've got a couple of questions here. Steve, maybe we can take one or two of these before we jump off.
Sure.
And any that we don't get to, we will follow up with you. So Steve, how much time should we expect to spend on all of this planning work?
Yeah, that is a great question. Yeah, I guess in my experience, it can vary pretty widely. You know, I've seen organizations do all of this in, you know, 6 to 8 weeks.